Have you ever stopped to think about what led Nebuchadnezzar to invade Jerusalem and set fire to Solomon's temple? In this video, we'll delve into one of the darkest chapters in biblical history, the relentless siege of Babylon, the famine that devastated the city, God's judgment foretold by the prophets, and at the same time, the hope that arose even amidst the ashes. Prepare to understand how the fall of Jerusalem was not just a political tragedy, but a spiritual lesson that continues to resonate today. A reminder that faithfulness to God is the true foundation that sustains a nation and a people. Before you watch, like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel. The rise of Babylon and the fall of Solomon's temple. The air in the ancient Middle East, around the end of the 7th century BC, was heavy with the dust of collapsing empires and the scent of rising new powers. For centuries, Assyria had been the great wolf, the undisputed power that kept kings and nations trembling beneath its sandals. But wolves also grow old. The great Assyrian Empire was crumbling, attacked from within by civil wars, and from without by a new and unlikely alliance between the Mede and a people from southern Mesopotamia, the Chaldeans, who now ruled a reborn Babylon. At the head of this new Babylon stood a man named Nebuchadnezzar. He was cunning, patient, and ruthless. He saw Assyria's weakness and exploited it, laying the foundations for what would become the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But the true force behind Babylon's meteoric rise was its son, a military genius and brilliant administrator, whose name would echo throughout history and the pages of the Bible. Nebuchadnezzar, meanwhile, squeezed between the giants, lay the small kingdom of Judah. Its capital, Jerusalem, was the beating heart of the Jewish faith, home to Solomon's temple. This was not just a building, it was the symbol of God's covenant with Israel, the place where heaven and earth met and where God's very presence. The Shekinah was believed to dwell in the Holy of Holies. The temple was the center of the people's national, spiritual, and cultural identity. Losing the temple was like losing one's soul. Judah lived on a political tightrope. The good King Josiah, who had sought to purify the nation of idolatry and bring it back to its covenant with God, made a fatal miscalculation. He attempted to intercept the Egyptian army led by Pharaoh Necho II, which was marching to aid the remnants of the Assyrian army against the Babylonians. In 609 BC, on the fields of Megiddo, Josiah was killed. His death was a national trauma, the end of an era of hope. With Josiah's death, Judah became a pawn in the great chess game between Egypt and Babylon. Josiah's sons, who succeeded him, lacked his faith and wisdom. They flirted with idolatry and, worse still, made the wrong political bets. The first Jehoash was quickly deposed by Pharaoh Necho, who installed his brother Elikam on the throne, changing his name to Jehoah as a sign of submission. For a time, Judah was a vassal state of Egypt, paying heavy tribute and looking anxiously to the north, where storm clouds gathered. The storm finally broke in 605 BC at a place called Carchemish, near the Euphrates River. There, the young prince Nebuchadnezzar, leading the Babylonian armies, encountered the combined forces of Egypt and the Assyrian remnants. The battle was a massacre. Nebuchadnezzar not only won, he annihilated his enemies. Egypt's power in the region was broken, and Babylon became the new undisputed superpower. News of the Babylonian victory traveled like wildfire, causing panic in all the small kingdoms that had backed the Egyptian horse, including Judah, while still on campaign. Nebuchadnezzar received news that his father Nabal-Esar had died. He needed to return to Babylon to secure his throne, but along the way, he did not forget that small rebellious kingdom in the Judean hills. He marched on Jerusalem. This was not an invasion of total destruction, but a show of force. He besieged the city, and King Jechem, seeing he had no choice, opened the gates. Nebuchadnezzar established his rule cleverly. He plundered part of the temple's treasures. The sacred vessels of gold and silver and took them to Babylon to be displayed in the temple of his god, Marduk. It was a powerful symbolic act. The god of Babylon had captured the vessels of the god of Judah. Furthermore, he deported a group of young men from the nobility and royal families. They were the brightest and most promising, destined to be re-educated in Babylonian culture to serve in the palace. Among these young men were 4 names that would become legendary: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, better known by their Babylonian names: Belshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This was the first deportation, a clear warning. Jehoiakim was allowed to remain on the throne, but now as a loyal servant of Nebuchadnezzar, paying a heavy annual tribute, rebellion and patience wore thin. For 3 years, Jehoiakim served Nebuchadnezzar, but pride and pressure from a pro-Egypt faction at court were strong. He hated the Babylonian yoke, ignoring the dire warnings of the prophet Jeremiah, who tirelessly preached that the only hope of survival was submission to Babylon as an instrument of God's judgment. Jehoiakim rebelled. He withheld the tribute, an act of direct betrayal. Nebuchadnezzar's response was not immediate. He was busy consolidating his vast empire. Instead of coming personally, he sent bands of Babylonian, Syrian, Moabite, and Ammonite troops to attack and weaken Judah, a guerrilla warfare tactic to bleed the kingdom dry. The land suffered, but Jerusalem remained standing. During this chaotic period, in 598 BC, King Jehoiachin died without honor. As Jeremiah had prophesied, his body, according to tradition, was thrown outside the city walls. His 18-year-old son, Jehoiachin, also called Jeconiah, assumed the throne. He inherited a rebellion that had never begun and a kingdom on the brink of collapse. His reign was sadly short. In 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's patience ran out. He personally arrived with the full force of his imperial army. The cities of Judah fell one by one, and soon Jerusalem was once again under siege. The young king Jehoiachin, seeing the desperate situation, decided to surrender to spare the city from total destruction. He, his mother, his wives, and his entire court left and surrendered themselves to Nebuchadnezzar. This time, the punishment was much more severe. Nebuchadnezzar plundered the temple and the royal palace more thoroughly, taking every remaining treasure he could find. And then he carried out the second and most significant deportation. He took King Jehoiachin and his family to Babylon, where Jehoiachin would remain a prisoner for decades. But he didn't just take the royal family. Nebuchadnezzar made Zedekiah swear a solemn oath of loyalty, an oath sworn in the name of the God of Judah. Breaking that oath would be not only an act of political treason, but also sacrilege, the final siege, and the cry of famine. For nearly a decade, Zedekiah ruled a kingdom that was a shadow of its former self. In Jerusalem, a foolish and dangerous optimism began to grow. Fueled by false prophets who proclaimed that the yoke of Babylon would soon be broken and that the exiles and the temple treasures would return. They saw the standing temple as a talisman, a guarantee that God would never allow his holy city to be destroyed. Jeremiah, now an elderly and lonely figure, fought desperately against this tide of false hope. He sent letters to the exiles in Babylon, telling them to settle down, build houses, and marry. For the exile would be long, 70 years. In Jerusalem, he walked with a wooden yoke on his shoulders, a living parable of the need to submit to the Babylonian yoke. For his words, he was branded a traitor, beaten, and repeatedly imprisoned. Zedekiah was a weak man, caught between Jeremiah's harsh truth and the seductive promises of his nobles and the envoys from Egypt. He secretly consulted Jeremiah, recognizing the power in his words, but publicly he yielded to pressure from his court. Finally, trusting in empty promises and military aid from the new pharaoh, uprising Zedekiah committed the final act of madness. He broke his oath to Nebuchadnezzar and rebelled. Nebuchadnezzar's fury was titanic. This time there would be no more warnings, no more second chances. In January 588 BC, the vast Babylonian army arrived and besieged Jerusalem. They built siege towers, assault ramps, and battering rams. The city closed its gates. Nebuchadnezzar's order was simple: no mercy. The final siege had begun. Months turned into a year, and then, in almost two, life within Jerusalem's walls became an indescribable hell, vividly captured in the pages of the Book of Lamentations. Food ran out. People ate sandal leather, dung, anything. The biblical text describes the ultimate horror: once compassionate mothers cooking and eating their own children to survive. The streets were littered with bodies, the rich and the poor dying side by side. Children fainted from hunger on street corners, begging for bread that was non-existent. There was a brief moment of false hope. The Egyptian army, fulfilling its promise, marched north to aid Judah. The Babylonians tactically temporarily lifted the siege of Jerusalem. To deal with this threat, the city erupted in celebration. The false prophets boasted, "See, we said God would save us." Jeremiah, however, knew the truth. He warned Zedekiah, "Make no mistake, the Egyptians will return to their land, and the Babylonians will return and take this city." That's exactly what happened. The Babylonian army's elite repelled the Egyptians and returned to Jerusalem, and the iron ring of the siege closed once more, now tighter and more hopeless than ever. Finally, after about 18 months of famine, disease, and despair, in July 586 BC, the Babylonian soldiers found a weak spot and breached the city's northern walls. The end had come. Fire, ruin, and the silence of God. The sound of battering rams shattering stone was followed by the war cries of the Babylonian soldiers who invaded the city. What followed was a bloodbath. They killed without distinction, young, old, men, and women. King Zedekiah, realizing all was lost, gathered his guards and his family and attempted a desperate escape under cover of night, through an opening near the king's garden, but they were spotted. Babylonian troops pursued them and captured them on the plains of Jericho. Zedekiah was dragged north to Nebuchadnezzar's headquarters at Riblah. There he faced judgment from the king he had betrayed. Nebuchadnezzar's sentence was designed for maximum cruelty. First, he forced Zedekiah to watch as his own sons were executed before him. The last image Zedekiah's eyes would see would be the death of his lineage. Then, Babylonian soldiers gouged out his eyes, plunging him into a physical darkness that mirrored his spiritual and political darkness. Blinded and chained, the last king of Judah was taken to Babylon to rot in a prison about a month later. In August 586 BC, Christ, the 9th day of the Jewish month of Hashem, a date that would become the saddest day in the Jewish calendar. Nebuchadnezzar, the captain of Nebuchadnezzar's guard, the man burdened with dirty work, arrived in Jerusalem. His mission was not just to conquer, but to erase. He began with Solomon's temple. For over 370 years, it had been the center of Israel's universe. Its walls were paneled with cedar from Lebanon and overlaid with pure gold. It housed the great bronze pillars, Yak and Boaz, and the enormous bronze sea. Its courtyards had echoed with the prayers of generations. Nebuzaradan and his men carried out a methodical and sacrilegious deconstruction. They broke the bronze pillars, the sea, and all the other bronze objects and carried them away as scrap. They took the remaining gold and silver vessels and then set them on fire. The magnificent structure that represented God's presence on earth was engulfed in flames. The cedar wood cracked, the gold melted and dripped like tears, and the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and black smoke that rose to the heavens. To the people watching from hiding or being gathered into exile, it seemed as if the sky itself was burning. It was a deafening silence of God. After the temple, they set fire to the king's palace, the symbol of Davidic power. Then they burned all the great houses of the city, the homes of the nobles and the wealthy. Finally, the Babylonian army began to systematically demolish the great walls of Jerusalem, the same walls that had cost them so much time to breach. Stone by stone, they tore down, ensuring that the city remained defenseless and could not be easily rebuilt. Jerusalem, the city of David, God's beloved, was reduced to a heap of blackened, smoking ruins, inhabited by ghosts and wild animals. Nebuzaradan gathered the remaining survivors, those who had not died in the siege, famine, or battle, and led them on a long and painful march eastward to exile in Babylon. He left behind only the poorest of the poor, the farmers and vine dressers. To tend the land and prevent it from becoming a complete desert, the promised land was now desolate. How does the story end? The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem was not just a historical event. It was a theological crisis of unimaginable proportions, for it called into question everything the people of Judah believed about themselves, their covenant, and their God. The God who had defeated Egypt and parted the sea could allow his own temple to be desecrated and burned by a pagan king. The response hammered home by prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel was as painful as the destruction itself. It was not Nebuchadnezzar who destroyed Jerusalem. It was God himself using Nebuchadnezzar as his servant, his rod of judgment. The destruction was the final and inevitable result of centuries of idolatry, social injustice, and covenant breaking. From the ashes of Jerusalem, yet a new faith would be born. Far from their land, in their temple, the Jewish people would be forced to encounter God, not in a building, but in his words. In the Torah, they would develop new forms of worship in the synagogue, and they would cling to the promise given by Jeremiah that exile was not the end. It was a purifying fire, a painful winter that, after 70 years, would give way to a new spring and a return. The destruction was not the final chapter, but the terrible and necessary preface to the story of resilience, restoration, and a faith that would learn to survive and thrive. Even in the shadow of a ruined temple, the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple were not only a historical disaster, but an eternal lesson. Nebuchadnezzar did not win because he was stronger than the God of Israel, but because the Lord himself allowed it to happen as discipline for a people who had strayed from his covenant. It was in exile that the people discovered that God is not confined to a temple, but present in his word and in every heart that truly seeks him. Thus, the tragedy of 586 BC, Christ also became a proclamation of hope. The Lord corrects, but also restores. He allows the fall, but prepares the return. Because even when all seems lost, God still writes new chapters of victory for those who remain steadfast in his promise.